The American Revolution was more than just a war. It was a profound and often painful argument about what it meant to be free. It was a time when ordinary people, farmers, merchants, and artisans, began to see themselves in a new light. They were not just subjects of a distant king, they were Americans. This idea did not appear overnight. It grew slowly in the towns and villages scattered along the eastern coast of a vast continent. People gathered in taverns and public squares, their conversations filled with whispers of liberty and complaints about fairness. They read pamphlets that challenged the old ways of thinking, posing questions that were both simple and dangerous. The conflict began with a simple yet powerful disagreement over money and control. Great Britain, an empire that stretched across the globe, had fought a long and costly war to protect its American colonies. Now, it needed to pay its debts. The British Parliament decided that the colonists should help pay for their own defense. They introduced new taxes on everyday items, things like sugar, paper, and tea. This was not just about the money, it was about a core principle. The colonists had no representatives in Parliament, they had no voice in these decisions. They called it taxation without representation, a phrase that echoed from the docks of Boston to the farms of Virginia. This feeling of being unheard and disrespected began to boil over. Small protests grew into larger, more organized acts of defiance. In Boston, a group of men, disguised as Native Americans, boarded British ships and dumped chests of tea into the harbor. This event, known as the Boston Tea Party, was a clear and dramatic statement. It was not just about tea, it was a rejection of British authority. The British government responded with anger, passing harsh new laws meant to punish the colonists and bring them back into line. These laws, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, only pushed the two sides further apart, making a peaceful resolution seem more and more unlikely. The road to war was paved with these escalating tensions. Each new tax, each new law, and each new protest added another layer of mistrust. The colonists began to form militias, groups of citizen soldiers who trained in their spare time, preparing for a conflict they hoped would never come. They started to communicate with each other, sending letters and riders between the colonies to share news and coordinate their plans. What had started as a debate over taxes was slowly transforming into a full-blown movement for independence. The colonies, once separate and distinct, were beginning to feel a shared sense of identity, united by a common grievance against a powerful empire. The Revolution was a story of people. At the center of the American cause was a Virginia planter named George Washington. He was not a natural-born revolutionary, but a man of quiet dignity and immense resolve. When the Continental Congress needed a commander for its new army, they turned to him. Washington was not a brilliant military tactician in the European sense, but he possessed something far more valuable: the unwavering trust of his men and an unshakable belief in the cause. He held the fragile army together through bitter winters and devastating defeats, his leadership becoming the very symbol of American endurance and the will to fight on against all odds. On the other side of the Atlantic sat King George III. He was not the tyrant he was often painted to be in American pamphlets. He was a dedicated monarch who believed deeply in his duty to preserve the British Empire. He saw the colonial uprising not as a quest for liberty, but as an act of rebellion and disloyalty. To him, the colonists were ungrateful children challenging a parent's rightful authority. He was determined to use the full might of his army and navy to crush the insurrection and restore order. His refusal to compromise, his firm belief in the absolute power of Parliament, made reconciliation impossible and set the stage for a long and bitter war. Between these two leaders were countless others whose names are etched into the story of the nation. Thomas Jefferson, a quiet scholar from Virginia, used the power of his pen to articulate the colony's ideals. He wrote the Declaration of Independence, a document that declared not only a separation from Britain, but also a radical new idea, that all men are created equal and have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Then there was Benjamin Franklin, a world-renowned scientist and diplomat. He spent years in France charming the royal court and patiently working to secure a crucial alliance that would ultimately help win the war for the Americans. The story also belongs to those whose voices were not always heard. Men like Thomas Paine, a recent immigrant, wrote a simple but electrifying pamphlet called Common Sense, which convinced thousands of ordinary people that independence was the only possible path forward. and on the battlefields, foreign officers like the Marquis de Lafayette from France and Baron von Steuben from Prussia offered their expertise to the inexperienced American army. They trained soldiers, planned strategies, and shared the hardships of the camps. Their commitment a testament to the fact that the American Revolution was a cause that inspired people far beyond its shores. The first shots were fired on a spring morning in 1775. British soldiers known as Redcoats marched from Boston to the nearby towns of Lexington and Concord. They had orders to seize a hidden cache of colonial weapons. But the colonists were watching. Writers like Paul Revere spread the alarm through the countryside. On the village green in Lexington, a small group of local militiamen stood their ground. A shot rang out, no one knows for sure who fired it, and a revolution had begun. The British continued to Concord, but on their march back to Boston, they were attacked from all sides by colonial farmers and townspeople, firing from behind stone walls and trees. The war was a long and grueling struggle. The Continental Army, led by George Washington, faced incredible challenges. They were often outnumbered and outgunned by the professional British forces. The soldiers were poorly fed, poorly clothed, and rarely paid. They endured the brutal winter at Valley Forge, where thousands suffered from disease and starvation, their footprints leaving bloody trails in the snow. Yet, they persevered. Key victories, though few and far between, provided glimmers of hope. The surprise attack and victory at Trenton on Christmas night boosted morale when it was at its lowest, proving that the ragtag American army could, in fact, defeat the mighty British. Life during the war was difficult for everyone, not just the soldiers. While men were away fighting, women took on new and vital roles. They managed farms and businesses, raised children alone, and organized boycotts of British goods. Many women, known as camp followers, traveled with the army, cooking, washing, and nursing the wounded, providing essential support that kept the army functioning. Families were torn apart by divided loyalties, with some remaining loyal to the king, while others joined the patriot cause. This was a civil war, as much as it was a revolution, pitting neighbors against neighbors, and sometimes even brothers against brothers. The turning point of the war came at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. There, an entire British army was forced to surrender to American forces. This stunning victory was more than just a military success. It was a diplomatic triumph. It convinced France, Britain's longtime rival, that the Americans had a real chance of winning. The French officially entered the war as an ally of the United States, providing much-needed soldiers, ships, and money. With French naval support, the balance of power began to shift. The war would drag on, but Saratoga had opened the door to a final, decisive victory for the American cause. The final chapter of the Long War was written in Yorktown, Virginia in the fall of 1781. General Washington, with the help of thousands of French soldiers, trapped a large British army led by General Cornwallis. At the same time, the French Navy blocked the coast, preventing the British from escaping by sea. Surrounded and cut off from supplies, Cornwallis had no choice but to surrender. As the British soldiers laid down their arms, a military band is said to have played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." It was a fitting song. A small collection of colonies had defeated the most powerful empire on earth. The end of the fighting did not immediately create a new nation. That process would be long and difficult. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially ending the war. Great Britain formally recognized the United States of America as an independent country. The new nation stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. For the first time, the former colonies were truly on their own, free to decide their own future. The joy of victory was soon replaced by the enormous challenge of building a government from scratch, a government that could unite 13 different states into a single, cohesive republic. Life after the war was profoundly different. The old social order, based on loyalty to a king and a distant aristocracy, was gone. In its place was a new ideal, one based on the rights of the citizen. People began to think and speak about politics in new ways. The ideas of liberty and equality, so powerfully expressed in the Declaration of Independence, took root. However, these ideals were not extended to everyone. The institution of slavery continued, a deep and troubling contradiction to the nation's founding principles. Women and Native Americans were also denied the full rights of citizenship, challenges that would shape the nation's story for centuries to come. The war had been won, but the revolution was not over. The first government, under the Articles of Confederation, proved too weak to handle the country's problems. So, the leaders met once again, this time to write the Constitution. This remarkable document created a new framework for a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. It established a system of checks and balances, a president, a Congress, and a Supreme Court. It was the final act of the revolution, a blueprint for an experiment in democracy that continues to this day. The war had created a country. The Constitution created a nation.